Welcome to St. Jerome's and welcome to the St. Jerome Center for Catholic Experience. My name is Scott Klein. And if you've been around St. Jerome's today, you know, that we've been through a bit of a, I don't know if it's a crisis, but I think we've had 10 power outages over the course of today. So, what can I say? If the lights go out, blame it on Ken Coates, I think, is what we'll do. So, but welcome this evening. It's very nice to see old faces, old friends, some folks we haven't seen for a while, and even some of you new folks. It's really good to see you as well. So, I think it'll be a wonderful evening of conversation. I just had dinner with the folks from the CBC, with Ken Coates, Ken McLaughlin, and I have to say this is the first time I've spent 2 hours and didn't ever say a word. I'm sweating, and I didn't even do anything, the amount of conversation. I suspect this will continue on into this evening. So welcome. As many of you know, this year marks the 25th anniversary of the St. Jerome Center for Catholic Experience. When the center was conceived back in 1982, it was thought of as a kind of place where people could come together from around the Kitchener-Waterloo region and discuss issues that matter, issues like social injustice, poverty, the environment, what it means to be a Canadian was one of the topics early on in the center's history. Tonight, our audience has expanded a little bit beyond the Kitchener-Waterloo region, and it has expanded with the help of CBC Radio and the Ideas program. Being an American, a U.S. American, I guess Canadians are Americans too, being a U.S. American, I had never understood what it meant to speak to Canada from coast to coast to coast. But apparently we will do this soon, and we will continue the conversation around issues that matter with the help of CBC Radio. So in that vein, we have two people who work with CBC and the Ideas program. We have the senior producer, Mr. Bernie Lucht. He's back in the cubby hole back there. So yes, Bernie is the brains behind the operation, I think, if I can say that, Bernie. We also have, and Paul knows what's coming, we also have Paul Kennedy with us. And Paul is he's not the face, but he is the voice of the CBC Ideas program. So if you've ever heard CBC, the Ideas program, you will immediately recognize Paul's voice. So I would ask that you help me welcome them to the St. Jerome Center this evening. So tonight's lecture is the 2007-2008 John J. Wintermeyer lecture. This lecture was created by the family and friends in memory of John J. Wintermeyer. It is intended to honor his work in religion and politics. Mr. Wintermeyer was a lawyer, a politician who led the Ontario Liberal Party from 1957 to 1963. He was a businessman, a philanthropist, a devout Catholic with deep roots in St. Jerome's University. We are delighted that Dr. Ken Coates has agreed to give this lecture tonight. And based on what I know about John Wintermeyer, and for some strange reason, coming to Canada, I ended up marrying into the Wintermeyer family, and I didn't even know it. So, and I call him Mr. Wintermeyer because his family still refers him as Mr. Wintermeyer. They have such respect for this man. But based on what I do know about John Wintermeyer, Mr. Wintermeyer, I know that he would be absolutely enthralled with the topic of tonight's lecture, Losing the Arctic, the role of the North in Canada's future. So my job this evening, thankfully, is basically over. I will turn it over to the people who are professionals at this kind of thing. I get paid to do this, but I don't know if that makes me a professional. So I will introduce now, he's going to come up on stage, Paul Kennedy, and Paul will introduce this evening's speaker. He will field questions and just be an absolutely marvelous human being. So please welcome Paul.
Not sure how you live up to introductions like that. Thanks, Scott. It's great to be here. This is the third year that CBC and specifically Ideas have participated in this lecture series, and we do so extremely happily because it seems to mesh perfectly with what we think we should be doing. And when you can say that, you're a very lucky man. We see ourselves not as the University of the Air, but as a forum within which ideas are discussed, and discussed openly, freely, debated, sometimes argued, sometimes heatedly, sometimes humorously, but always in an atmosphere of mutual respect. And I guess that's how I would describe the place within it, which I work, and why I am indeed such a lucky man. And I think it's the role that we see for ourselves as a unit, as a show called Ideas, that functions within the larger context of the CBC, which I hope, and I think you probably hope as well, in some way does the same thing. It is a forum for discussion in which Canadians can talk amongst themselves from coast to coast to coast. And it's indeed an honor to be associated with the show and to take the show out of studios in Toronto and literally into the streets or into the cities or into the country itself. And it's something that I have certainly felt in my years as host to be one of the main mandates of the show, to get out, to prove, as I said initially a few times, ideas can travel. And we do. And this association with St. Jerome's is indeed one of the things that I am very happy to be part of and happy to continue year after year after year, this year being our third year. It's my job to introduce the speaker. Before I do that, though, I'm going to have to ask you to participate in a tiny little radiophonic ruse. And that is that when I say, I'm Paul Kennedy and this is Ideas, can you try not to laugh? And maybe make some other appropriate response, or maybe that is the appropriate response. But we will be recording this, and you are indeed part of the recording. And so I'm going to say, I'm Paul Kennedy. Welcome to Ideas. Welcome, in fact, this evening to the campus of St. Jerome's University, where we will be hearing a lecture called Losing the Arctic, the Role of the North in Canada's Future. I want to say first, though, how happy I am to be at St. Jerome's, participating in this lecture series for the third time. It's a series which is open to exploring all kinds of ideas in all kinds of places, and we have been part of that series for 3 years and hope to continue to do so in the future. Tonight's lecturer is a very interesting man, in fact, somebody who could probably apply for a job at Ideas, and if we had sufficient funding, would be hired. But we can't do that. Happy to have him here this evening. He was, if you do a quick Google search, which is where a lot of academic research is apparently being done these days, a quick Google search will tell you that Ken Coates was born in Banff. And I haven't done the proper Google research on this as well, but he may be therefore the only European Canadian to have been born in Banff, because I don't think there are many others who ever could claim that distinction. Probably a number of Aboriginal Native Canadians could claim it, and I think a growing number of grizzly bears can make that claim. But he is the only white person I've ever met who makes that claim. He didn't grow up in Banff. He grew up, in fact, in the Yukon. And if you have good eyes from the back row, you may be able to see that this evening he is wearing a tie with a Yukon shield of arms on it. That, I think, that experience has considerably affected the scholarship that he does and the kinds of views that he has about the world, which is why it will be very interesting this evening to hear him talking about the Arctic. If you do the Google search, you will see that he has had a job similar to the one he has right now in a number of places across the country, which also gives him the qualifications to speak about Canada from a number of very different perspectives. He was, I think, first the academic vice president at the University of Northern British Columbia, his first administrative job. He was an academic before that. Followed that up with similar jobs. I think he was Dean of Arts at the University of New Brunswick, and then also similarly at the University of Saskatchewan. He is now the Dean of Arts at Waterloo University, and he is uniquely qualified to talk about losing the Arctic, the role of the North in Canada's future. Ladies and gentlemen, Ken Coates.
Well, thank you, everybody. It's an absolute delight to be here tonight. I'd like very much to extend my thanks to the Wintermeyer family for making this evening possible. I'm also very delighted to be here with CBC. You'll know, those of young men in the audience here will realize one of the most important things in life is trying to impress your mother. And I've discovered so far in my life that I've done two things that have impressed her. One was actually taking her to a university faculty club for lunch. The second one is actually meeting Paul Kennedy. This lecture this lecture series is designed to look at the public good, to look at efforts that have been made over time and in our contemporary world to create positive responses to the challenges of our age. And I hope tonight I can speak to you about something that offers you an optimistic tale. That actually at the end of this, the title of this talk is Losing the Arctic, but it has a question mark at the end. And when we get to the end, I hope you'll see that what the story I have to tell, which I hope you'll find convincing, is that there's some really exciting things to be done in the far north. The rhetoric about the Canadian North right now is as thick as an Arctic blizzard. Canada's on alert. You've probably heard all of this. The Russians are coming. It isn't the Russians, it's the Danes who are coming at us, those dastardly Danes who are trying to take over Arctic islands. They're encroaching on our Canadian territory. The Russians, the Americans, refuse to acknowledge our claim over the Northwest Passage. How dare they? Russian submarine crews actually went to the North Pole and deposited a titanium plate on the very bottom of the Arctic seabed, claiming it for Russia. The interesting part of that story is when they went back to Moscow, they were greeted with an absolute hero's welcome. And Canada was ticked off. Stories circulate now of Asian countries and shipping companies that are actually planning on building new vessels to exploit the opening of the Northwest Passage as a shipping route between Europe and the east coast of the United States. So here we go again. the Canadian North is back in the headlines once more. 30 years ago, you might remember the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline inquiry, when the North sort of jumped into sort of national prominence, because northern oil and gas was actually going to solve two things. If you remember these debates, it was going to solve Canada's fiscal crisis. We're going to pay off the debt, pay down the deficit, but it was also going to solve our energy crisis once and for all time. It didn't work that way. A few years ago, diamonds were discovered in the Northwest Territories. And in a new version of the Klondike Gold Rush, we rushed north again because here was exactly the proof of what the North was, a great treasure trove, a wonderful attic where you could go to find the greatest resources available in this great land of ours. Now, a challenge to Canadian sovereignty has actually turned our faces northward once again. And in good Canadian fashion, we have mounted our national Huffmobile and are pontificating noisily about the vital role that the Arctic has always played in Canadian affairs. And in doing so, we're neglecting one of the most important truths of our history, and that is that the southern Canada has neglected the north systematically from the late 19th century to the present. In fact, we'll talk about this very briefly. We rally to the cause of the Arctic basically only when somebody threatens to take it away from us. We will, in time, respond to the sovereignty challenge, or perhaps it will take care of itself. We will build some small ships and we'll do some patrolling on some parts of the Arctic for some parts of the year. The ship we're planning on building will actually be based, I believe it's in Halifax and Esquimalt, British Columbia, those major centers of Arctic research and Arctic navigation. We will do the best we can in Canadian fashion to defend our interests before international tribunals, and we will wage a battle in the court of public opinion. And most importantly, we'll wait for the passage of time to solve this particular problem. A few years of cold weather, and maybe the Northwest Passages will freeze over, and the people in Asia will not build ships to go through our Arctic. Maybe the legal issues will be resolved, the conflicting claims will disappear, and the current crisis itself will erode. But as Canadians, perhaps we should be a little bit embarrassed. We're only marginally aware of the fact that among the nations of the circumpolar world, Canada may well be the least northern of those countries. We may be the least prepared to tackle the real challenges of science, development, and social change in the far north. So let me start off with the not-so-optimistic part of what I want to talk about tonight. I figure it's better to end with the good stuff, not with sort of the scary stuff. But the good, there's both, in some equal measure. Hope you'll agree. A lot of attention right now is focused on the environment. If you doubt whether there's global climate change, I invite you to go to the Yukon, to the Northwest Territories, or to Nunavut. In the north, there is widespread awareness of what is happening. Talk to native elders who work on the land and have traveled the land, and they will tell you a whole bunch of things. You've probably seen those wonderful maps of the retreating Arctic ice, which are kind of very worrisome when you think about it. All the ice is disappearing, the Northwest Passage is open. But there's other changes equally important but more subtle. The permafrost may be melting, and we don't know what that really means. The patterns of animal and plant life appear to be shifting. The weather clearly is getting warmer. For a long time, people have said environmentally that the Arctic is the globe's canary in the mine shaft. It's the place to look to see what's going to happen to the rest of us 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 years down the line. If the Arctic is a canary in the mine shaft, this one's starting to squawk, and this one's actually getting weaker all the time. Environmental change appears to be happening quite dramatically in the Arctic, and there will be few places on Earth where the impact of incremental changes in climate are more evident. Use the example of the Northwest Passage. We've been chasing after a route between the Atlantic and the Pacific and Asia from the 16th century on. The Europeans have sent ship after ship after ship sailing into the Arctic, continually running afoul of ice and very daunting and dangerous waters. We've been debating the whole question of whether the Northwest Passage is an inland waterway or an international waterway for a long time, but it was a legal debate. It was one of those things that was a nice thing to argue about conceptually because nobody was really going to take very many ships through icebound waters. The United States did not accept Canada's argument. Canada's argument simply was that these were inland waters. They were therefore part of Canada. There were times actually where they were arguing quite vociferously, and still do, that in fact because of the nature of the ice in the area, because it was connected to the land, and because the Inuit worked on the ice, that in fact we should contemplate this simply as an extension of the land and therefore an area subject to Canadian regulation and subject to Canadian sovereignty. The United States, more loudly than others, but not alone in the nations of the world, claims that the Northwest Passage is an international waterway. It's like going through the Straits of Gibraltar. You can't stop people from going through here. This is an international waterway. It connects two major bodies of water, and people can go through whenever they wish. But again, it's what we call an academic question, a nice theoretical issue to debate about in history classes and political science classes. And then what happens with amazing quickness is the ice starts to melt. Global warming hits. Passageways we thought would be closed forever are now actually opening up. They're taking cruise ships into big parts of the Northwest Passage. Absolutely quite dramatic. The Americans are keeping up pressure, and Canada responds as it does in such circumstances, not with military vessels and legal action, but with moral persuasion. please don't go there. And in fact, if you go there, please tell us ahead of time so we know you're going there, so we can tell you we don't want you to go there, but it's okay actually because we can't stop you from going there. Someone quintessentially Canadian about that, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I think Canada's quite a lovely country. There's other stories, though, about what's going on up north, and they're not all negative. About the diamonds. Interesting. The discovery of diamonds in the north created an entire new economy. Yellowknife is booming right now because of what's going on in the diamond areas. Although it's interesting, last year, the ice roads they used to supply the diamond mines were open for 2 months less than they had in the previous year and the year before and the year before that. And it's really interesting. They're actually flying drums load of oil into these mining camps to actually keep them supplied over the course of the summer. And they were counting on taking this stuff in by truck, which is way cheaper than flying it in. Great excitement because of the diamonds. But there's more, much, much more. Estimates right now have it that about 25% of the world's remaining oil and gas are to be found in the Arctic, creating one of the most ironic spirals, or potentially creating one of the most ironic spirals in world history. And that is that because of global climate change, which is largely connected to the burning of fossil fuels, the Arctic ice is opening. And because the Arctic ice is opening, you can actually get up there and drill for oil and gas, produce more of these damaging emissions, and actually then create even more climate change. 25% of the world's remaining oil and gas supplies. Now, there's a rush to the north. For a long time, not many people had heard of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. But the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea spells out a very, very important series of rules about who gets to claim the seabed. Who owns the bottom of the ocean? Because whoever owns the bottom of the ocean, whoever has continental rights, has exploration rights for offshore oil and gas. Suddenly, scientists have been thrust to the forefront of the circumpolar debate. They've been dispatched north to map the seabed. Canada has to rent space on somebody else's ships to get up there, at least for part of the exploration that they're doing. And Canada is now rushing to backstop its claims to the resource potential of the area. Not since the 1970s, when oil and gas were being developed in the Beaufort Sea, did the North hold such promise for solving a major problem for this country. For those of us who, as historians, have followed the history of the Canadian North, these are actually not new stories, but actually quite familiar stories. The resources are a bit different. The actors have changed a little bit. We've been down this path a number of times. More often than not, Canada has not paid much attention to the far north until people from outside the area expressed an interest in it. It was thus when the whaling started happening off Herschel Island in the 1880s and 1890s. It was the same when largely American miners started developing the gold potential of the Yukon, the Klondike Gold Rush that started in 1896-97. It was the same again during World War II when it was Americans who developed most of the Northwest defense projects in the Second World War, fending off the potential attack from the Japanese. It was the same as well in the 1950s and 60s when the post-war militarization, remember the Cold War, and building up of the DEW line and building up of intercontinental ballistic missile capacity, not a capacity, protective capacity. Again, Canada's sovereignty was threatened. We have a pattern here, and the pattern is one of Canadians not being terribly interested in what's going on in the North. Kind of feel badly saying that because you've come out on a frosty night to listen to somebody talk about the North, and here I am telling you don't care much about the North, so there's an interesting contradiction just in this audience as well. But the neglect was well set. It's important to recognize that the Northwest Territories was managed out of the capital of the Northwest Territories till 1967, and that capital was a city called Ottawa. It's not terribly close to the Northwest Territories. That the Yukon, that had actually in the early part of the 20th century actually developed a territorial council, developed an administrative system, and had that largely dismantled during and after World War I. The North struggles to attract the attention of the country as a whole. And here's where some of the oddities and some of the contradictions really start to take hold. We have a very strange relationship with the North. We don't go there very often, but we're fascinated by it. We're truly fascinated by it. We are extraordinarily fond of Northern imagery. It shows up in our art, it shows up in our poetry, it shows up in our literature, it shows up in our paintings, it shows up in our fascination with Inuit carving. It shows up in our films. But we're more connected to the South. When we take our holidays, we're far, far more likely to head to Florida than to Nunavut. We're far more likely to go to California than the Yukon. Very few Canadians holiday in the North unless, and only people from Toronto would do this, consider the Muskokas, the Bruce Peninsula, and the Georgian Bay truly northern territories. The true mystery and majesty of the North, and I can assure you that it is mysterious and it is majestic in every conceivable meaning of those terms, holds greater fascination for Americans and for Germans and for the Japanese than it does for the vast majority of Canadians. They did a wonderful thing in Germany a while back where a tire company made an ad in the Yukon. And it's one of the things they're trying to promote these tires. Let's get these tires sold. So they ran a contest. And people who bought tires had their tickets put in a barrel and you pulled them out at the end and everybody got to go on jump on a plane and flew to Whitehorse in the summertime. That was a nice kind of thing to do, right? They had the travel agency that organized it was inundated with people who said, I don't care about the tires, I just want to go to the Yukon. They now run a charter service from Frankfurt, Germany to Whitehorse all summer long. People who fly over there, they don't do one straight from Toronto yet. We'll work on that. We've got an interesting change occurring as well. Over the last 25 years, this country has been seriously and tremendously enriched by the changing ethnic composition of Canada. New Canadians coming to us from countries all around the world. But put together two pieces. The vast majority of the people in Canada live within 150 miles of the southern U.S. border, southern Canada-U.S. border. And many of the new Canadians who are coming in likewise live in the southern part of the country. These new Canadians come from other nations that have virtually no connection to the Arctic, whether it be from Africa, the Caribbean, or from Asia. They do not bring with them personal historic connections to the Arctic. We do not, in our classrooms, give a lot of attention to northern issues and northern concerns. So it's hardly surprising that as the new Canadian portion of the Canadian population grows, that very few of them develop a very strong connection to the far north. Tourism statistics help out a lot here. More than 75% of the visitors to the Yukon are from the United States. Now what's interesting is the vast majority of those are actually going to Alaska, and there's no way to get there by car unless you go through the United States, go through the Yukon. So they're not really all that excited about Yukon, it just gets in the way. But only 15% come from Canada, from the rest of the country. And most of those are from British Columbia and Alberta. Germany, the United Kingdom, and Japan. More visitors come to the Yukon from California than either Alberta or Ontario. More people come from Florida than either Alberta or Ontario. In the 1970s, and some of you will remember the 1970s, remember the jobs they used to create in the 1970s? You want a job, here's some money, go do whatever you want, kind of thing. I had a job counting cars. It's a quintessential 1970s job. And I sat on the side of the road and said, there goes a car. And I would write down that it was going north or south, and whether it had 2 axles or 3 axles or 4 axles, and I'd take a guess at where it was from. Right? And we actually could sit close to the road and figure out coming from the Yukon or coming from a local car or whatever else. You got to think about doing this job at 3 o'clock in the morning. We did this 24 hours a day in the middle of July, listening to radio stations from San Francisco, because when you're actually up north, the radio is really quite wonderful. You listen all over the world. It's really quite great. And one little car going this way, one little car going that way. Same thing. If we saw somebody from anywhere in Canada east of Alberta, we felt like we should throw ourselves in front of them and give them a hug. And there were so few people from that part of the world that came up north. Californians, Floridians, commonplace. They were there all the time. Quite astonishing. My other job in the 1970s was actually, some of you remember this as well, remember metrification when it was a new idea? They decided one summer they would actually take the mileposts. Alaska Highway used to have these very famous mileposts along the road. And I was given the job of taking the mileposts out and putting in kilometer posts. And the numbers aren't the same, right? And so what happens is BC wouldn't change. This is Canada after all. So British Columbia had mileposts till you got to the border, and then you had kilometer posts. And actually there's a place once you get into the Yukon where the road actually dips down into British Columbia again. So you had mileposts, kilometer posts, mileposts, kilometer posts, right? And I had a whole bunch of Canadians threw things at me. And, I was just doing my job, sir, taking these things out. I'm convinced there's a whole bunch of Americans who are still lost in the Yukon because they couldn't figure out what happened to all the miles in between. The Twilight Zone happens just outside of Watson Lake. The situation in the Northwest Territories in terms of tourism, by the way, is a bit different. 77% of the visitors actually come from other places in Canada, and Ontario is the major sort of source of these individuals, but they're primarily coming to visit family and friends. The Northwest Territories doesn't have a huge tourism industry. The high-value tourism industry, which consists of hunting lodges, fishing lodges, ecotourism, and what have you, and a growing winter market for viewing the aurora, comes from the United States, from Germany, and from Japan, which sends something like 10,000 people a winter. In the aurora are considered to be, the northern lights are considered to be incredibly important in the north itself. Compare this to what happens in southern Canada, where every year hundreds of thousands of snowbirds head south. What a strange name. Snowbirds are supposed to be the birds that stay around, and in fact we call them snowbirds when they go to Florida. But we had thousands of people heading south, very few heading north. It's not that the north has been entirely ignored. We found some things to talk about. And what's been talked about for the most part has been about economic and social crisis. And you will probably have heard these stories and thought about them for a while, I trust. The long-term effects of residential school. You may have heard about the relocation of Inuit families and whole communities that were taken out of Keewatin District in northern Quebec and relocated to the high Arctic islands, and the dislocation and their subsequent demand for compensation. You may have heard about the steady loss of language and culture among the Aboriginal populations, and about the serious social and other problems facing the communities in the north. We do a very good job in this country of finding out our faults. We do it quite systematically. So probably you've heard about the housing crisis. It's not uncommon. In fact, it's more common in Nunavut to have more than one family in a home. Homes that are designed for 6 will have 15. Not uncommon. The housing crisis in many of those communities is absolutely acute. We hear about those particular kinds of things. We hear about the patterns of drug and alcohol abuse, the very serious problems of domestic violence and criminal behavior. If you look at some of the key political leaders in the North, you'll discover that they themselves have recovered from very serious personal problems with alcohol abuse and sometimes criminal activity as well. In fact, when you think about what you hear from the North, more often than not, it's a litany of social crises, statistical impressions of communities that are in decay and in dismay. We hear of isolated settlements that seem to be completely excluded from the global economy, of centuries-old indigenous cultures that are on the verge of collapse. And when we look north and hear these stories, we're actually quite saddened by the loss of something very, very important. So I could spend the rest of my time elaborating on those particular things, but I suspect you've heard them before. But I want to tell you of something very different, because I think one of the most important stories going on in Canada actually takes place in the far north. It is something that has occurred with dazzling speed. It is a revolution of transformative capacities. It is still underway, and it, quite frankly, my friends, it is an absolute marvel to watch. It started in the 1970s and early 1980s. It picked up speed for the 1990s, and for the past decade has been one of the most remarkable political and social transformations we have ever seen. It may be one of the most dramatic political and regional transformations in Canadian history. It isn't as exciting as Russian submarines and staring matches with the Danes on Hans Island. And before the Danes went to Hans Island, you'd probably never heard of Hans Island. And you might know now that the resolution is that Hans Island belongs equally to us and to them, which is a quintessential Canadian resolution. It isn't as exciting as blaming George Bush for sending ships through the Northwest Passage. But I think what I'm going to tell you about is of greater importance and is actually far more exciting. What you want to tell you about is a bewildering mashup of land claim settlements, self-government agreements, regional economic development strategies, environmental regulations, that has actually turned the North on its head. We have a region where Aboriginal people have emerged as preeminent decision makers, where brand new political structures have actually emerged almost overnight, where we have a roadmap for the development of rural and small-town Canada that could actually teach everybody in this country something quite remarkable. We have seen, without telling anybody, the creation of a brand new North, and it is one that warrants new and extensive attention. I'm not going to tell you everything that has happened. I want to whet your appetite and get you looking for more, and I hope you will. But I think a partial list of the kinds of things that are going on will give you a sense of this remarkable transformation. Few places in Canada have experienced the kind of political change that I wanted to describe. In the 1960s, the Yukon and Northwest Territories were colonies. They were administrative and political colonies. They were governed by Ottawa, regulated by appointed commissioners. These commissioners, my family knew them well, not bad people. In fact, some of them quite remarkable. Elected representatives in these areas bitterly resented the lack of control over territorial affairs. The commissioners were the final decision makers. The changes started slowly. It was only in 1967 that the capital of the Northwest Territories was moved from Ottawa to Yellowknife. Commissioner Stuart Hudson arrived and ushered in a brand new development. But just consider what's happened since that time. In 1975, the Northwest Territories secured a wholly elected territorial council for the first time, with the last of the appointees replaced by local residents. At much the same time, the Yukon introduced party politics, mirroring the partisan political structures of the South. At the same time, in the middle of the 1960s, the Yukon publicly debated the prospect of seeking provincial status. They found a supporter in a brand new political leader by the name of Joe Clark, future Prime Minister of the country, leader of the Progressive Conservative Party. When he ran for the leadership of the Conservative Party, he had one member of Parliament supporting him, a man by the name of Eric Nielsen, who represented the Yukon for many, many years. So in return for that, Joe Clark offered to support provincial status for the Yukon. He came to a wonderful rally in Whitehorse where he made a speech saying, within my first term of office as Prime Minister, I don't think he knew it was going to be quite so short, within my first term of office as Prime Minister, the Yukon will gain provincial status. And I was sitting in a room sort of an audience about this size, and Joe stood back from the platform, and I think he thought we were going to pick him up and put him on his shoulders and march him around the room, and there was dead silence. The week before, somebody ran an analysis in the newspaper saying it would cost every resident $7,000 a year in taxes to have provincial status, and that was just one balloon that lost all of its air very, very, very quickly. So, no provincial status. But when he did become Prime Minister of the country, what Joe Clark's government did do was expedite political development in the North by granting responsible government to the Yukon in 1979 through a device called the EP letter written by Jake Epp, who was the Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development. What he did was simply told the appointed commissioner, from now on you will follow the leadership and the guidance of the elected representatives of the Yukon Territorial Assembly. Alan Christensen, longtime Yukoner, very good commissioner of the North, resigned in protest. But the Yukon had, in 1979, responsible government. The list is only beginning. The Northwest Territories decided not to offer partisan politics and instead adopted a consensus-style government. Drawing on Aboriginal traditions, they did not allow party politics to develop. Instead, what happens is the local constituencies elect people, the representatives get together, they vote on the premier, they vote on the cabinet. Anybody who's not in the cabinet, by definition, is an opposition member. And then after one term in office, they vote on a different premier. They rotate the premier's job. No dynasties in the North. In fact, in many of these communities, people get acclaimed into public office. You have basically two variations. You either get a situation where the person is so popular nobody bothers to run against them, but it's also not uncommon to get sort of 7 or 8 people running and have somebody win with 15% of the vote, which is a very different political sort of system. In the middle of the 1980s, the Yukon and Northwest Territories faced the prospect of permanent territorial status through provisions of the Meat Lake Accord and the Charlottetown Accord that would have made it virtually impossible to ever aspire to be provinces. And they fought back on the national scale against that particular campaign. At that time, you remember we used to have First Ministers' conferences all the time, and the premiers and the Prime Minister would gather together and plan things? The government leaders from the Northwest Territories and the Yukon would have to sit outside in the hall until it was actually time to discuss a northern issue, and then they could come in. Now they are full membership at the First Ministers' meetings. And then they started devolving federal responsibilities. The federal government looked at the development of responsible government in the North and said all of these colonial structures no longer work. We are going to transfer to the territorial government all of the responsibilities that are appropriate. Basically all of the province-like duties and obligations. The negotiations dragged on for years and years, incredibly detailed discussions about how you actually pay for this transfer, how much money has to come along, when things are going to actually take place. Hundreds of federal civil servants transferred from the federal government to the provincial government. And you know what? I bet you've never heard a peep about this because they did it brilliantly. It worked extremely well. Hundreds of people went from being 20-year civil servants in the federal government to being permanent members of the territorial administration without very many crises at all. And then they divided the Northwest Territories. Northwest Territories had 2 big problems. One was that it was too big. It was a huge territory covering an enormous amount. And the distance between Yellowknife and the Inuit of the Eastern Arc was simply too great. Long discussions leading to a referendum, lengthy discussions on where the border would go, and the official creation of Nunavut in 1999, an event that attracted global attention. Was actually at the Canadian Embassy, Canadian Consulate in London, England, on the day that it actually took hold. And there was a tremendous amount of interest. This unique jurisdiction, the Inuit are among the most famous indigenous peoples in the world. The globe has always been fascinated with the Inuit. And here they've been given their own political jurisdiction, probably the largest indigenous-controlled jurisdiction in the world. And the Inuit were prepared to contemplate so many fascinating things: an Inuit language administration, Inuit-controlled government. They even had a plebiscite on establishing gender parity in the legislature. They debated whether they would have, in every riding, you would have to elect a man and a woman. And they had a plebiscite on whether this would actually happen. The vote lost, 57% opposed, but the simple fact that they talked about it tells you something about what they were prepared to contemplate. And as another example in the stages of change and transformation of the North, the Yukon negotiated a complete revision of its founding legislation. The Yukon Act was drafted in 1898. An agreement was reached to change this in 2001. It became effective in 2003. And what it did was modernize the document. Remember, responsible government existed on the basis of a letter from the Minister of Indian Northern Affairs. Now, under the new Yukon Act, responsible government is part of the constitutional fabric of the North. That's a lot of change in a very short period of time. But remember how small these places are. The Yukon's population right now is only 31,000. There's 43,000 people in the Northwest Territories. Nunavut only has 30,000 people. It also has 21% of the landmass of Canada. Quebec has 15%. Northwest Territories is 300,000 square kilometers bigger than Ontario. And the civil services are larger than they are in the South. But think of all the work that was done renegotiating all these developments with the federal government. I went to a couple of the meetings in Ottawa. It was just absolutely fascinating. You go down with a group of people from the Yukon, and you go into one meeting and negotiate one set of deals with one set of bureaucrats. You go to another meeting, it'll be a completely different set of civil servants from a different branch, and negotiate with them. A very small cadre of civil servants renegotiated the constitutional framework of the North. And the interesting thing is, that's not the most important set of developments. Those are interesting, a complete transformation of the political culture. Aboriginal land rights. An even greater transformation of the North. The North, Aboriginal people in the North have been asking for attention to their land rights for a long time. The first comprehensive claim in Canada, except for negotiations, was submitted by the Council for Yukon Indians in 1973. Very few Yukoners took it seriously. They thought this wasn't going to go very far. Dene Nation very shortly thereafter launched their land claim process with breathtaking assertions of Aboriginal rights and independence from Canada. Everybody dismissed it as a radical organization. And in fact, most people said it was only because there were a bunch of left-wing agitators, mostly from Ontario, who'd actually come up and sort of stirred things up. Otherwise, the Indians would have been happy with the way things were. Not true, but a convenient explanation for what was actually going on. So negotiations started, and then they bogged down, and they started again, and then they collapsed, and they restarted. One of the turning points in the whole process is when the government of the Yukon got directly involved in their land claims negotiations. People complained about what they called the land claims industry, with lawyers and consultants and negotiators supping off negotiating tables endlessly. And then in 1984, the Inuvialuit signed a claim that covered the Western Arctic. All of a sudden, people realized that everybody meant business. Aboriginal claims to the land and its resources and compensation were settled one after the other, capped in 1993 by the signing of the Nunavut Agreement in the Eastern Arctic and an agreement with the Council for Yukon First Nations. Most of the territorial north is now covered by Aboriginal land claim settlements. Got to tell you one thing first, two things, I guess, actually, about Aboriginal land claims. The first one is that for Aboriginal people, the land claims process is widely seen as their last chance. This is the last chance to get the resources, the power, the control, the ability to influence their future. They had to get it right. That's why the negotiations took so long. They desperately had to get enough power, enough money, enough resources, enough of a role in the future to make sure this would actually work. The second thing is, when these negotiations happened, we realized very quickly that there were two separate negotiations going on. The federal government saw land claims negotiations as an end in itself. Let's get this off the table. They talk about certainty. We've got to clear the way so we can develop the resources of the North. Let's get on with business. For Aboriginal people, land claim settlements were a means to an end. The end was cultural survival. There's no question. Cultural survival. It was not about getting money or getting land. It was about having the capacity to control the future. So what did the settlement bring to the North? The first thing is, the settlements are really important for a whole bunch of reasons. All those Aboriginal leaders who spent 20 to 30 years negotiating Aboriginal land claim settlements are now working on community economic development, social development, cultural development, educational development, and healthcare. It's amazing transformations. But in addition, Aboriginal communities received substantial amounts of land, surface and subsurface rights. They received sizable cash payments in the tens of millions of dollars. They now have investment capital, training programs. They can build their own capacity. They have funds for economic development. Aboriginal communities have been empowered. Resource developers have to negotiate with them if they hope to sort of make deals and work in the North. The agreements gave Aboriginal communities the right to negotiate self-government agreements. It did not require them to be self-governing, but allowed them to become self-governing when they felt they were ready, which opened up the capacity for evolution and change in remarkable short order. Co-management has emerged as the major element in Northern politics and administration. Aboriginal people were guaranteed substantial representation on every major board and regulatory agency in the territorial North. Everything from heritage conservation, development permits, land and resource management, wildlife management, and long-range planning. This sounds like a political scientist's dream and a nightmare for the rest of us. Technical, bureaucratic, constitutional. The significance is absolutely stunning. Communities that in the 1970s could only dream of the opportunity to control their destiny, a quarter of a century later, making decisions completely on their own. Control of housing allocations, decisions about post-secondary grants, allocation of economic development funds. You have seen as a consequence the growth of confidence, engagement, and a sense of accomplishment in Aboriginal communities and territorial governments. And there's so much more going on in the North. Huge government investments in the infrastructure of the region. The one that affects me the most is that in 1972, the Canada-Russia hockey series, we did not get to see it live. All the rest of the country, most of the rest of the country saw it live. We got it on tape delay. As I listened to it on the CBC, we're very pleased with that. In very short order, the North was saturated with satellite television. New schools opened up, replacing the reviled residential schools. Colleges developed at Nunavut Arctic College, Aurora College, and Yukon College. Medical services expanded greatly. The major cities had improved hospitals, and in recent years have telehealth connections to southern specialists. Satellite-based delivery systems are bringing high-speed internet into all but a few communities in the North. And the changes keep going and going. You remember the 1960s, the company town phenomena? You might have heard of places like Polaris and Nanisivik, Pine Point and Clinton Creek, Faro, all mines that were developed in the Yukon and Northwest Territories. They developed company towns around them. They seemed to be the foundation for a brand new North. And then the mines closed and the company towns closed down. Clinton Creek was taken off the map. It's all gone. It's gone away. It doesn't exist anymore. Faro was kind of interesting. They really tried to kill that town. And I'll tell you, the folks of Faro are not going anywhere. They've been pushing really, really hard to keep the community going. The reality was that company towns distorted the North. They created artificial and temporary islands of prosperity, centers that were destined to close down when the mines ran out. You're then seeing, as a consequence, some very, very different approaches. The new mines that are occurring in the north, the mines at Ataki, at Jericho, at Aviak, Snap Lake, and Kennedy Lake, don't have company towns. The workers fly in. They live in temporary quarters. And don't feel too sorry for them. Those temporary quarters sort of look somewhat like a five-star hotel, so they're not exactly suffering too much when they're up there earning very substantial money. But even the Aboriginal employees, for the most part, fly into these camps. Most of the workers live outside the north. They commute to their families in the south, in southern cities. And interestingly, the government doesn't necessarily see this as a particular problem. We're seeing new models of economic development occurring across the north. There are problems. The Northwest Territories still needs a revenue-sharing agreement with the Government of Canada. Nunavut has some very, very serious financial challenges, but different kinds of engagement. Remember the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline debate? The Mackenzie Valley Pipeline debate has been transformed. Aboriginal people will own 1/3 of the pipeline when it is built down the Mackenzie Valley. Remember, they were the ones in the 1970s that stopped at the Berger Commission. They actually stopped it from happening. They are active supporters. Not all of them. The Decho and the Southern Mackenzie are very much opposed to it. Or not opposed to it. They haven't settled their land claim yet, and they want to make sure they're part of it. What an amazing contrast that has been. What's also interesting is the manner in which the North has become a center of international engagement. You had this sort of sense that, boy, this place could be intensely parochial, worrying about small-town developments. I think the North is one of the most internationally engaged places in Canada, and one of the best in the world. The Inuit Circumpolar Conference brings 160,000 Inuit together from around the globe. The Arctic Athabascan Council, Gwich'in Council International, work across national boundaries. The Northern Forum, a group of sub-regional or sub-national governments from 10 Arctic countries. The Arctic Council that brings together national representatives from Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and the United States. The Northern Premiers get together all the time. And one of the most remarkable developments, and again remarkable because it's for the North and we don't hear much about it, is the University of the Arctic. The University of the Arctic has brought together between 90 and 100 colleges and universities from all around the circumpolar world, basically creating an internet-based classroom that links people all around the North in a wonderful opportunity to study together and study from each other. You have a class where you're talking about regional economic development, and you have students from 6 countries, different ethnic groups and their backgrounds, all in the same classroom. And we could go on. There are so many interesting things. The continued development of Aboriginal arts, Indigenous music, dancing, and filmmaking. Have you seen the beautiful film The Fast Runner? Absolutely marvelous document. Does not emerge in a vacuum. That was not a surprise result. The development of Indigenous television, radio, and new media outlets. Take a look at Northern Native Broadcasting Yukon, one of the most innovative and important regional media outlets in the country. The empowerment of Aboriginal women, they play a major role in northern development. Major improvements in Indigenous-newcomer relations across the North. Many of the people who live in the North now have gone there because they get to work with Aboriginal people. That was not the way it was 30 years ago. Wonderful collaborations. The northern non-Aboriginal population is stabilizing. Tony Pennicott, former Premier of the Yukon, used to say that people came north to make a killing, not to make a living. They're not doing that anymore. We are seeing a new North. So what is the future of this place? This wonderful and marvelous place. Southern interest will remain, I think, episodic and sporadic. There's no evidence yet that the Government of Canada is going to militarize the North in a major way, and that would have profound impacts. I don't think it will happen. We will see Southern opinion rise and fall over time. That will just be part of what actually happens. The North has not always been better off when the South does pay attention, by the way, because you get booms and busts that actually have profound effects. The territories were Canada's colonies, but so very much have changed. Not everything is perfect, far from it. Global climate change, international economic pressures, the possible remilitarization of the North, the potential development of oil and gas in the region. But who would have guessed 30 years ago that the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut would have the capacity to contribute so much to this country? There are many times I might tell you that I wonder about Canada's future and about our ability and determination to respond to the challenges of the 20th century. We have a well-entrenched pattern in this country of punting our major problems forward to the next generation, hoping that we can wiggle through contemporary challenges with just enough care to avoid catastrophe. And then, when I get depressed, I look north. The people of Nunavut, the Northwest Territories, and the Yukon are taking control of their future. Some of the most innovative policies, programs, and initiatives in the country are emerging out of a region that we basically ignore. No area in Canada is responding better to the challenges of bridging the gap between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. No area spends more time debating the best means of converting resource wealth into long-term benefits for communities and regions. There are huge problems. Everybody associated with the North knows the social and economic problems are serious. But it is such a different place. It is self-confident. Stronger links between populations, empowered, focused, and determined, with regional autonomy and Aboriginal self-government. So what images should we use for the North? There's a new one that's popped up. You probably saw the Time magazine with a polar bear sitting on an ice floe, and the implication was global warming has left this poor little bear to sort of swim around and maybe he's going to die. Nobody said that's where bears like to spend a lot of time because that's where the eating is best, right on the edge of the ice. It's very good for them. They're actually pretty good swimmers. And what those photographs do is they re-mythologize the North as an isolated place with a few polar bears. I have different images. There are places of beauty. Go to Tagish, please, in the Yukon. Go to the Nahanni Range. They are wonderful. There are other images of overcrowded Inuit housing and crisis in native communities that carry more sadness than hope. There are diamond mines and oil rigs and first-class wilderness lodges that reflect the image that we feel more comfortable with across Canada, that of a great northern treasure trove and a wide open wilderness spaces. My favorite images are a bit different. Check out Chief Jimmy Brano School in Baie-Choco, Northwest Territories, or the Carcross Community School in the Yukon, and see the future of empowered northern communities. Listen to Nellie Cornwallier, Chair and Chief Executive Officer of the Inuit Regional Corporation. She manages an asset fund of $267 million. Talk to Paul Burkle, one of the major leaders of the Yukon First Nations people, and see why Aboriginal people have made such great strides. Look at Northern Native Broadcasting. Sit with the deputy ministers of the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. Get a sense of the commitment, the innovation, energy that is shaping the new North. Watch what's happening with the mines in the North, and see how resource development is being shaped to meet Northern needs and aspirations. Spend some time with Paul O'Callagh, the Premier of the Nunavut, and hear of his dreams of a region of cultural renewal, self-determination, and responsibility. Maybe attend the Yukon International Storytelling Festival and see how Northerners have learned to live across cultural boundaries and enjoy the traditions that each one of them brings to the table. The developments that really matter in the North are not at Hans Island and they're not the race to the bottom of the Arctic Sea. They're happening at the community, regional, and territorial level. A new North is under construction. It is a North that will be controlled by Northerners in the North and for Canadians. And it's developing without a lot of Southern interest or even Southern attention. And maybe that's the best. Who knows? The social challenges and the cultural threats facing the North are profound. But for the first time, the North has the political will, the personnel, and the authority in place. It will take time for what has happened over the last 30 years to take hold. It has been a remarkable series of changes, so fast, so comprehensive, and so diverse. It'll probably take another 30 years for the full effects to be seen, and it will probably take just as long for Canadians to realize that one of the most important transformations in Canadian history is actually taking place north of 60. Canada is not losing its North. It's gaining a new North, empowered, creative, determined to be part of Canada's 21st century. So look north, not for mystery, not just for mystery, adventure, and wilderness. It has all of those in abundance. Look north not just for wealth and jobs and opportunity, although increasingly it has those as well. But look north and see vibrant Indigenous communities. See Aboriginal renaissance and revitalization and rebirth. See new models of local governance and collaboration and economic development. Look north and see a region that is justly proud of its accomplishments. See a North that is overcoming its past and looking to the future. Please, my friends, look north and see your country's future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken Coates, for that inspiring vision of the North. We have a few minutes, maybe 10 or 15 minutes for questions, and there is a microphone set up over here and another one on the other side of the house. People can come to the microphones. I will only ask a couple rules. One, give us your name, because this is possibly going to be broadcast on IDEA, so proceed with your name, and then give us any brief biographical information that might help us situate you in where your question is coming from. Aside from that, make them questions and not speeches, please. Precede your question with a brief preamble if that is necessary, but we would like to have as much time as we can to get as many people asking questions as possible. However, if nobody comes to the microphone, someone else.
Hello, my name is Roland Hall. I'm a researcher at the University of Waterloo. I do research in the North, an ecologist. And I've gone and seen many communities, and I have seen a lot of transformation that you're talking about. You have more experience with the people, and my question is this: with all this change, how are the people adapting? And I think I'll try and specify that a bit more. There is tremendous opportunity for those who are really capable and have that leadership skills, management skills. There are those who live off the land, who work at the more blue-collar end of the spectrum. Are they both going to be winners in this as the cultural identity benefits, or is one going to win and the other lose?
That's a fabulous question without a really clear answer. What's really happening is that the Aboriginal connection to the land is weakening, and weakening faster than what we would like to see happen. Young people are young people. They're connected up to the 500-channel universe. They play video games. They follow a different lifestyle, different expectations. They're having trouble getting a lot of young people to go back on the land. They're trying to build cultural camps. They're taking kids from classrooms out into the land and trying to sort of reintroduce them. And there's something so sad watching how that's evolving, because it's becoming less an integral part of lifestyle. Some communities much better than others, of course, as you probably know. What's really fascinating, of course, and I guess I can use lots of different names, but I shouldn't use their names. The Aboriginal leaders who are working in these communities could make way, way more money if they didn't work for Aboriginal governments. These are smart people. Nellie Cornway is brilliant. She's truly astonishing. Paul Burkle, many others. They stay and work in their communities, and they're not going to move. They're going to keep doing that, right? That is something profoundly different than the way we operate in Canada as a whole. And I think there's some real lessons in there. They themselves are trying as leaders to connect up and sort of reinforce the cultural developments and what have you. There's some real sadness around the loss of language. Most of the languages are too small. Inuktitut's going to be okay just because it's got size and scale and you can develop sort of economies of scale and curriculum and things of that sort. But more generally, it's a real problem. So we're going to see change. The question isn't change. Every society changes. Our society changes. Every society in the world changes. It's a question of are they changing at a pace and in a direction that they choose? And that's actually the positive thing that I see happening. So young people are being given the chance now to go to university or go to college and come back and work in their communities doing a job that actually connects up with their lifestyle and their value system. We're going to continue to see a rapid change, and I think, if you want to call it that, a decline in traditional activities, traditional culture, and that sort of thing. But that's actually pretty common around the world. Not just Indigenous populations. We're moving to sort of a unicultural sort of society generally. It's just a question of control and not having to leave. One community in the Northwest Territories this year awarded 23 post-secondary scholarships, a community of 2,500 people. And they awarded 23 post-secondary scholarships to people from that community. When I went to university in 1974 from Whitehorse, the largest community in the Yukon, one Aboriginal person went to college that year. When you see people in this community going to PhD programs in England and 5 different universities in the South and college training programs, they're picking their futures, and so many of them are picking futures where they come back and work in their communities. And that's the part that's really quite wonderful. If I can just alert you again, I'm not naive. There are serious problems, and you'll know from being in some of those communities. The biggest one is that the accomplishments and the aspirations of young Aboriginal men are not keeping up with what young Aboriginal women are doing. So the women are more likely to go to university, more likely to go to college, more likely to become a teacher, more likely to become a nurse. And you've got a gender problem that's really starting to take hold up there. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Nick Shrubsel. I'm a first-year doctoral student here in religious studies. I was wondering if the combination of the lack of Southern interest in the North and the progression, sort of achievement of power in the Aboriginal groups in the North politically is somewhat a slap in the face to Southern Aboriginal groups who are trying for many of the same, striving towards many of the same goals, but failing because they don't have enough of the numbers to do so.
That's a terrific question. It's really interesting. The territories are blessed. They have a special constitutional structure that gives the federal government more of a role. They are among the most heavily subsidized societies on the face of the earth. Just the nature of the beast. There's not enough private sector activity going on. Very substantial transfers from federal government to keep the area going. If you want to see areas in difficulty, go about 20 miles south of the Northwest Territories Yukon border, where, because they're provincial governments instead of territorial governments, the constitutional structures are different, the financing are very different as well. There are some very interesting things happening in different parts of the provincial north. The Nisga'a, for example, in northern British Columbia have done some really quite remarkable things. But the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut have really special opportunities. And we're going to discover, for a whole bunch of reasons, that the area of Canada that's going to be in most profound difficulty is going to be the provincial north. A friend and I wrote a book about this one time. We called it the Forgotten North because it operates at a very, very different power system, with a very different level of attention. So everybody knows where Nunavut is, but most people don't pay much attention to what goes on in Flin Flon, because it's in a provincial or a different environment. So absolutely causing some difficulties. But on the more positive side, what's also happening is that the North is actually establishing models that are testable. You're looking and saying, well, okay, that does work. And then it's kind of intriguing watching. And just in this regard, watch 2 things. Watch Quebec. Quebec has long had a history of having difficult relations with Aboriginal people. They just set up Aboriginal self-government on a regional basis. They took the main part of northern Quebec and put it into one administrative district. Most Aboriginal self-governments, the economy of scale is too small. It's done at the community level, and ultimately it will have problems. What Quebec did was said, listen, let's create a whole region. It's an enormous area, and let's make that the part of the country, and then give them responsible government over their own affairs. There's a really great possibility there. I think watch that with close interest. And watch Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan is the first part of the southern part of the country to really get a handle on the importance of integrating Aboriginal people at their time and their direction into the broader sort of provincial mandates and activities. And Saskatchewan's been doing some very, very interesting things for the last 15 years in the northern parts of Saskatchewan as well. So it's not all bleak. But the Northern Territories have greater opportunities because of their constitutional arrangements. And the people of Nunavut have known for an awfully long time that, quite frankly, there's an awful lot more attention to what they do than there is to the First Nations in Northern Ontario. They have a special sort of claim on international attention, and they've capitalized on it.
Thanks. Scott Slocum, Wilfrid Laurier University. I've been looking at parks and resource and environmental management in the Yukon for 20 years now, and hence recommend Kluane for a visit if anyone wants another recommendation. But no argument with the deep changes that land claims and devolution and other changes have made there over the last 20 years. There's an argument that what it's done most of it has made it a lot more complicated. What would you say to that?
I would agree with you completely, because if you look at the Yukon has 14 different First Nations negotiating land claims agreements, and economies of scale don't work. These are communities, many of them under 1,000 people, and they're trying to set up very complicated administrative structures. And these things are going to take a while to sort of settle down. I think what you're going to see over time is that some of the First Nations will combine some of their activities and they'll share resources and things of that sort. Things have become an awful lot more complicated. They were complicated for a long time, as you well know, by the absence of land claim settlements. And sort of land was reserved and the government wasn't allowing people to sort of take private land and what have you for a very, very long time. So in one sense, there's a bit more certainty. But, we're so new into this game. The land claim agreement in the Yukon was signed in 1993. It's only 14 years. It takes the communities a long time to come along. And there's no question whatsoever about that complexity. And one of the things we're realizing is that from the Aboriginal perspective, things going slowly doesn't worry them as much as it does a lot of the rest of us. We're used to things going fast, and they look and say, pipeline, hasn't done it yet, wait a couple of years, okay, we'll make sure we get it right. So sometimes there's other parts there. There also, to be really fair and clear, there are capacity issues. And the capacity is just a sort of northern jargon or Aboriginal rights jargon for whether or not the communities have trained personnel with sufficient background in education and training to actually take on the jobs that are at hand. And in many, many places, for very good reasons, you've got 1 or 2 or 3 well-trained people who are trying to manage 7 or 8 or 9 major portfolios. One of the things that has happened is that we have really overburdened the Aboriginal leadership. The key people there are just being burnt to a crisp. So there's lots of reasons for it, but I certainly would agree with your main point. Absolutely.
I'm Andy Houston. I'm a theater researcher and an artist working here at the University of Waterloo. I'm working with a group of students on a project that's exploring the land claim crisis in Caledonia, and that land claim includes land that we're currently on here at St. Jerome's University. I'm just wondering, Dean Coates, if you might comment on how what you experienced in the north might be beneficial to solving this local problem.
All right, we'll be finished by midnight. The local problem is really serious and really sad. And you know this because of how the community that was actually functioning relatively well all of a sudden finds its relationships turned upside down. One of the things that happened up north, and Yukon's a better example here. In Nunavut, negotiating co-management when the only other people who are using the resources are other Inuit people is not really a lot of co-managing anything, right? Northwest Territories is a little bit more. But in the Yukon, Aboriginal people represent only 30% of the population. And so in that particular setting, they've had to negotiate a situation where you have a non-Aboriginal majority. When the processes got started, these things started off very confrontationally. I mean, there were people in the Yukon who said, there's no way we're going to sign land claims agreement with Yukon people. They don't deserve anything. It's all just a scam. What are we doing? All this kind of stuff, right? Over time, people all of a sudden got to the point where they said, we actually are going to be around together for a very, very long time. And we are going to have to sit down and negotiate things. And we are going to have to pay an awful lot of attention to making this work for all of us for the long term. And what's really fascinating is I vividly remember in the late 1960s when the first Aboriginal person that I knew of, I was a kid at the time, moved into a non-Aboriginal suburb. It was like, oh, did you see that? A First Nations person, called them Indians at the time, was living down the street. So what? Well, it's a big deal. Nowadays, it's not a big deal at all. Right? And it was Whitehorse. Whitehorse got problems. Whitehorse got serious problems. Amazing place. Watching this place I grew up, it's not the same place at all. And watching the integration of Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in positive ways that respects differences is astonishing. So a lesson for Caledonia or insights to Caledonia, take a look up north. Get some people from there to come down and talk about how important it was to get down to the root causes. Find out what was really causing the crisis there in Caledonia, right? What happened, what changed the directory and the direction of negotiations in the north is the point at which the non-Aboriginal government realized it was everybody's interest to resolve the problem. As long as it's seen as Aboriginal people against everybody, we're not going anywhere. As long as you realize that resolving these issues in a way that is sustainable, just, and fair right, actually produces some lasting arrangements. And one thing I will say, one thing about the situation in Caledonia, just for your benefit, I've watched these things that happen across the country as a whole. Make sure you realize that the most important thing about Caledonia is the control that the leadership of Six Nations is exerting over the Aboriginal protest. Those protests would be 10 times larger if the community was not exerting an awful lot of control and regulation over it. The elders are working extremely hard to stop it from going further. There is a lot of anger in what they call Indian country across this land. A young Aboriginal man, dispossessed, angry, frustrated with negotiations that dragged on for years and years and years, and the Aboriginal leadership is doing an amazing job of keeping that under control. Doesn't feel like it. If I was a non-Aboriginal person living in Caledonia, I'd be a bit miffed by what's going on. So watch. You're not going to see this. Nobody will see this. This is all happening in houses and in meeting halls. But that's actually what's the most important thing that's going on there right now. But the long answer is you've got to work these things out, and you've got to work them out. The non-Aboriginal people have as much an interest in resolving this as the Aboriginal folks.
My name is David John. I work here at the University of Waterloo. A few years ago, I had the privilege to be part of a group that developed a new university program for young people at the Six Nations Reserve to help them transfer comfortably to universities in this area, 5 universities in this area. There was some success and also some frustration. There were 2 main problems, and I want to ask you about them. One of them you've touched on already, and that was the problem of language. We realized that by having these young people make the transfer away from their homes, we were actually probably undermining their desire to continue education and learn more about themselves and their disciplines in their own language. And of course, these languages were represented by about 1 to 2% of their population at that point. Hardly anybody spoke them, and we couldn't make progress on that. The second point was a bigger one. The very idea of the university and the notion of authority and the notion of rational thought. We brought to that project our Western ideas of what the foundation of knowledge is and what constitutes knowledge and acceptable authority. And of course, their sense of knowledge and authority was very different socially. And we found that was a confrontation of approaches that was difficult to reconcile. Now, you talked a bit about language and that being a problem in the North, but you also talk about the explosion of colleges and the University of the North. How do they come to grips with the Native peoples, Indigenous peoples' knowledge, sense of authority as opposed to the Western European one?
Very, very good question again. A lot of the sort of approach to education is they're more comfortable. I mean, it's horrible generalizations. They're absolutely wonderful Aboriginal philosophers and historians and literature novelists and what have you. There's a high level of comfort with technical education, learning how to manage resources, learning how to be a biological technician or what have you, particularly when there's a respect for Indigenous knowledge. The Northwest Territories in particular is having very, very long negotiations and discussions about the recognition of traditional Indigenous knowledge within their scientific system and within their scientific granting processes and what have you, lots of negotiations around that. And it's really causing some difficulties for some scientists who go and say, well, I know how to count caribou. I don't need you to have an Aboriginal elder to show me how to count caribou. And it creates some tensions. And we got a new breed of scientists who've actually realized they can learn from each other. And some really interesting science has developed. Sometimes a little bit too uncritical acceptance of some of the Indigenous traditional knowledge, and those things take a while to work out. You sort of balance these things off sort of over time. On the Aboriginal side, it's kind of on the business of students coming to universities. Universities are cultural places. They're ideological places. They reflect a value system of the society that spawned them, in this case, Western Europe. Very individualistic. Go into your first-year class and say, okay, class, we're going to give 1 grade this year. We're going to take all the grades in the class, and we're going to average them together, and that's going to be the grade the class gets. Try it. Students won't like it. What are you doing? What, some socialist or something like that? They're going to be really upset at you for doing some crazy thing, right? Try the same thing in Aboriginal communities. Okay, that's all right. Makes sense to me. I mean, we'll work on this together and take a different approach. Who knows? We'll try something different. We shouldn't apologize for our system. You will not make accommodations with Aboriginal communities if you start by sort of pretending that your system is hugely flawed. Our system, the university system, has great strengths, one of which is the capacity to continue to learn. So I'll use an example from the University of Northern British Columbia, where I was involved in its early founding. We worked with the Nisga'a community, Nisga'a First Nation, Nass River Valley, northwest corner of the province. And we're sitting down talking about they wanted education in their community. And they said, yeah, but we don't want your kind of education. We don't want you just to come in and lecture to us. They said, what do you want? I said, we want you to recognize that our elders are professors too. So we did. All right? We acknowledged that the teaching of courses were done with Native elders alongside Western-trained anthropologists and historians and what have you, right? Because there's a different way of transmitting knowledge and there's a different way of examining knowledge. And we actually worked out, it's called Wilpwahas Niska, the Nisga'a House of Learning. And it actually continues to operate today. They're graduating lots of people every year. And the neat thing about it is they want non-Aboriginal people to come study with them. This is not about them studying themselves. It's actually about the opportunity to share their knowledge with the rest of the world. So one of the things you'll find is that the Yukon College, Aurora College, Nunavut Arctic College, most of their successful programs are actually based on adult basic education, very basic skills, reading, writing skills, that sort of thing. And many of them are community-based. Yukon College has 13 campuses in a territory that has 31,000 people, right? And it's a very different model. And the campuses sometimes are just a trailer or part of a high school. They're just small little centers. And what happens is you let people study where they are until they're ready to do something different. And most of the Aboriginal people who are going on to university and getting their graduate degrees and stuff are coming back when they're considerably more mature. They're in their 20s, late 20s, early 30s, rather than being 18 and 19 years old. So it is a big change and a big transition. I'm just worried sometimes that we want to rush over, and we should, to make accommodations for Aboriginal communities, but you don't do it by sort of pretending that your system doesn't have strong value, because it does. We learned a lot through our system, science, our system of learning, our system of knowledge, but we should be open to learning the other ways. And there's actually a fair amount of that going on. In Canada. When you describe the situation here, what happened across Canada is we brought too many Aboriginal students onto our campuses too soon. We weren't actually prepared for them. We didn't have services for them. We didn't realize the changes that we're going through coming from a small reserve community coming into a big environment like this. And we were just too anxious to sort of meet our desire for sort of the right number of Aboriginal people on campus. Certainly was the case out west. We're learning slowly. Very successful models where you actually take the university into the community and you leave it there. Why the University of the Arctic, I think, is going to work, in part because they have a lot of the content is actually both controlled or actually produced, but also vetted by Northern Aboriginal people. And they participate in a lot of the course development, and that's from around the circumpolar world. Thanks.
Serendipity, actually, that's a perfect length of time for questions and exactly what we booked. So thank you for asking your questions. Just a little bit of business before I turn things back over to the folks from St. Jerome. The first item of business is that you can find the broadcast date for this evening's program sometime probably just before the new year. We'll be posting a calendar and it will have the date on which this event will be broadcast on Ideas. Other business, I certainly want to thank you for what I think were very good questions, excellent questions. So the questioners, first off, should be thanked. All of you should be thanked for coming out on what is an Arctic sort of night. And finally, I would personally like to thank Ken Coates for a very inspiring vision of the North that we hope will be the future of our country. Thank him. Now back to Scott.
To conclude this evening, I've asked Dr. Dave Perrin, our president at St. Jerome's University, to offer a formal thank you and on behalf of St. Jerome's University. Dave?
Thanks very much, Scott. It's a pleasure and an honor to be able to thank Dean Ken Coates on behalf of all of us for the presentation of the Wintermeyer Lecture 2007. I certainly would like to thank all of you for coming out this evening. It's a pleasure once again to see you participate in the Center for Catholic Experience here at St. Jerome's University, and thank you for coming out to be with us. The lecture this evening was established by friends and relatives of the Wintermeyer family. As has already been indicated, we once again want to thank those people for their gracious and generous offerings that have made this evening possible for all of us. John Wintermeyer's commitment to public life and Catholic education was very much in evidence in the lecture we had this evening, characterized by inclusiveness, openness, critical, new ideas, and fresh thinking on a topic that affects all of us. I also would like to thank the CBC for your presence here with us this evening, Bernie Luke and Paul Kennedy. What a pleasure it is to have such an august group come and bring this message across Canada, coast to coast to coast. But most of all, it is my pleasure to thank my colleague, our colleague, Ken Coates. The first time I met Ken in August this past summer was part of the interview process when I came here to St. Jerome's University in the capacity of interviewing for president. One of the components of that full day-long, 15-hour grueling interview was to spend 1 hour with Dean Ken Coates. Of course, I was appropriately trembling and nervous as I walked into his office. He was there, T-shirt, pants, summer attire, very casual, me in suit and a rather tight tie around the collar. I didn't have to say much. I thought I was going to have to do all this talking and sort of explaining my position. Why would I want to be here? I sat down, I was immediately relaxed, and Ken began his narrative. You can understand why. That day he evidenced intellect, wit, and good humor. all of which we have seen tonight in great quantity. His intriguing analysis. He's exposed our indifference to such crucial issues, even our ambiguity. He's told us that we've looked to the north, but for some reason we dare not touch. He's invited us beyond that fear, beyond that strangeness, to ask ourselves some intriguing questions once again. Why not go there? He's engaged our imagination. He's spun a narrative, a mythos in good Ricardian terms, a plot, a way to get us engaged and thinking in our imaginations about this wonderful northern part of Canada that you so much have experienced. You've led us along the path of a critical reflection that relates not to the distractions of tourism, sea passages, oil and gas, or even the sparkling allure of diamonds. Rather, you've created a mythos that relates to people, people of the land, people of the earth, people of Canada. You've talked to us about the birth of a community, the birth of many communities in 21st century Canada, about communities that have pre-existed our own times and for which you have given them great honor. You have recognized that they have a unique identity, an autonomy, a culture, a system of government, and systems of all kinds, in many ways for which we can only be enviable. So, Ken, thank you for opening up this brave new world to our imaginations, to whet our appetites, as you said you hoped to do, and no doubt you have greatly succeeded. Thank you.
And just a few housekeeping matters. On your way out, there is a booth. The Social Justice Committee of the University Catholic Community sells fairly traded organic coffee, chocolate, and tea. At the back, on your way out, there is a sign-up sheet for next season's brochure. There's also a sign-up sheet for email reminders. I have heard rumors that there was confusion about tonight, whether it was going to take place because of snow squalls and those kinds of things. If you don't hear word from us via email, assume that it's on. Tell your friends. Some of them probably didn't show. There is a book display out in the foyer. Wordsworth Books has a number of books, not only of Ken's, but also many of the lecturers this season. I would like to extend a special thanks to Megan Lasseline, who works with me trying to put this together, the St. Jerome's IT department for the sound and the computer and so on, and special thanks to Carol and Ivan Person. Carol is the person that makes it really go here. Say hi to Carol on her way out. And thanks to CBC Radio for their commitment to sparking conversations across Canada. One final thing, I wouldn't be doing my job well if I didn't mention two lectures that might be appealing to a number of you based on tonight's theme. On January 11th, Dean Miroslav Tatarin, the Dean of the oldest university in Waterloo, here at St. Jerome's University, will be giving a lecture entitled God Keep Our Land, talking about Canada's uneven history of immigrant integration, looking at different ways that this has happened throughout Canada's history. And also in March 2008, Don Martin is a donations bucket. If Ken has in any ways sparked your interest this evening, and if you want to support the center and many of the lectures that we have here, stop by. These donations are tax deductible. There is absolutely no compunction to give. Just goodwill. It's that time of the year. Smile at us on the way out if you don't give. So, regardless, I wish you all the very best. It's been a wonderful first half of the season. I look forward to seeing you in the new year. Until next time, I wish you all peace.